Can I have your attention, please? Hello. I want to welcome you all to our colloquium today. For those of you who are new, I'm Martin Sanchez-Jankowski, and Director of the Institute, and I'd like to ask you all to check your cell phones and put them on silent mode, please, before we begin. And as you're doing that, let me make an announcement of an upcoming event. On Tuesday, October the 27th, Troy Duster, who is Chancellor's Professor of Sociology at UC Berkeley, will give a talk entitled The Molecular Reinscription of Race in Science, Law, and Medicine. And the talk will be from 4 to 5:30 here in the Voldovsky Room. And of course, subsequent announcements will be on our webpage. The format, as most of you know, is that our speaker speaks to us for around 45 minutes, and that will be followed by a question and answer period. And the questions today will be moderated by Assistant Director Christine Trost. And what she usually does is she looks at your hands and raise them, please, and continue to raise them, and she'll put you in the queue. And then our speaker just has the opportunity to answer. It's my pleasure to welcome back Professor Corey Abramson, who received his BA and PhD from the University of California at Berkeley in sociology. He is assistant professor of sociology at the University of Arizona, and prior to that, and between his PhD and his taking the position at Arizona, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Philip R. Lee Institute for Health Policy Studies at the University of California at San Francisco. His research uses both quantitative and qualitative methods to examine how persistent inequalities are structured in everyday life and how they are reproduced over time. Currently, he is involved in a methodological project that focuses on developing ways to improve rigor and transparency in the collection, analysis, and representation of ethnographic data. And he's one of the authors in a recent article that has come out in Social Methodology. Today's talk is based on his recently published book, The Endgame: How Inequality Shapes Our Final Years, which is published by Harvard University Press and just came out in 2015. And before I welcome him here, I also want you to know that today, he is in an article in Section D of the New York Times, which it looks at inequality among the aged in the United States, and starts with a quote from him. So we should all be so lucky. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Corey Abramson.
Thanks for the great introduction. I think luck is the appropriate term with that. So today I'm going to be presenting a few findings based on the recent book, The Endgame, which examines how inequalities, both past and present, create a sort of system of inequality in later life, and examining what this tells us about inequality and stratification in America more broadly. So the first thing I need to address, I always get asked, why study the aged? In fact, I think the last time I gave a talk in this room as a practice job talk, it was one of the first questions. So the answer people are usually fishing for is something like a deep personal story or a narrative, how I came into this. But that's not the way that I came across this project. I selected it because I think it's important on a human level, on a policy level, and I also think it's incredibly useful on an analytical level. And it's something that of course there are key exceptions in this room, but a lot of sociologists have sort of glossed over the utility and the importance of looking at later life. So on the analytical level, there are really two key points. The first is later life is one of, excuse me, I always have to do that at the beginning of the talk. At least I haven't spilled coffee on myself yet. It's one of the two key points in the life course where there is an acknowledged and generally accepted intervention into inequality. You see it in early life with the promise of public education and schooling, and you see it in old age with the promise of entitlements. Of course, all these things, particularly in an election year, are always on the chopping block. So it allows us to see how these interventions work out, or in fact, how they don't. But there's a second reason, which is that later life, like childhood or earlier points in the life course, or a few earlier points, allows us to examine shared challenges, right? Shared dimensions, practical challenges of social life. So in the case of later life, you have people from different backgrounds facing things like declining mobility, the death of friends and loved ones, the physiological issues associated with the wearing out and breaking down of the body, what this signifies in a youth-oriented society, or what Pierre Bourdieu called the similarly shaped problems of social action. So by examining this set of similarly shaped problems, I could see how inequalities, both past, that is people's experiences with the social world, and present, where they live, the resources available to them, etc., affect how they navigate the world. So analytically, I think it's a particularly useful point. And unlike children, the study of innumerable sociological inquiries, and quite important ones, the aged, or older people, or whichever term I use is going to offend somebody, but I just presented this to a senior center, and I tried to get consensus, and nobody had consensus for which term was the least offensive. But here, people roughly over 60 have already been exposed to a lifetime of inequality. So it allows us to trace out some of these temporal connections, to look at the experiential components, how that affects people's decisions. And, another key point is that age is a salient aspect of stratification in its own right. So it's a durable inequality. People are treated differently, different challenges. That doesn't always make it into our sociological pantheon, but I think is key. So in short, I could give you the personal story, but I chose old age because it's a useful and underutilized lens for understanding how the mechanisms of inequality shape everyday life. So that's my answer to the first question. So if you were going to ask that one, I think I answered it, but I'm happy to talk more. So more specifically, what did I do? The research was guided by a series of empirical questions. The first was, how do the mechanisms of inequality, things like networks, neighborhood effects, access to resources, education, culture, etc., shape everyday life for older Americans? And here I defined older Americans as age 60 and over. And the reason I selected this low threshold, because a lot of people might say, well, 60 isn't that old, is because a lot of inequality plays out prior to that period. So typically the most disadvantaged are not going to live to be 85 and to be in a study like mine. So in order to maximize variation and to get those who would be already dead, if I set a higher threshold, I set a low threshold at 60, with a lot of people saying I'm not old, and I would say, of course, well, tell me more about that. So it's true, that's what I am. I take that seriously. I listen to what people say. The second question is, how do women and men from different demographic groups, so in my case, different race, class, and gender groups, manage the demands of aging in everyday life, both the practical issues associated with things like arthritis or health problems, and the symbolic issues with going into a store and somebody saying seeing only wrinkles or talking to the younger person. So the stigma and whatnot that's attached. And so the question here is not whether or not a correlation exists between material inequality and aging. In fact, we know it does. And this is one of the points that I think they made really well in the New York Times article, not based on my research, but a broad volume of epidemiological, public health, stratification literatures that show that who survives to old age, when the body breaks down, etc., is a function of inequality, as are some of our options. So the question isn't whether or not the correlation exists. This is essentially established fact. But how the micro, meso, and macro connections work, converge, etc., to shape people's everyday experiences and responses. So the somewhat messier component of it that's not as easily operationalized. So for instance, why do some seniors go to a doctor every time they have a sniffle, while others wait until they're dragged to the ER? My family tends to be in the second category. Why do we see variation even within a socioeconomic strata or a neighborhood? So, somebody made a point, well, you're just explaining our R squared, and I said, well, it's 80% of the variation. And so for me, explaining that residual is actually quite important and useful for understanding how key mechanisms of inequality operate. And on a related methodological note, sort of pet peeve of mine, why do people that look the same or very similar on surveys make choices in very different ways? So there are some measurement issues. I started my master's, this was the book's based on my dissertation, having huge effects by neighborhood, by race, by gender. I wasn't able to model them away, so I said maybe I need to go into the field and examine some of this. And then the broader question, the sociological question, is what does examining later life tell us about the mechanisms of inequality more generally? So going from the specifics of aging to the larger debates about how social systems, and in particular a stratified American social system, operates. So for the methodology, and I love talking about methodology, hopefully my asides won't make me go over. It's based in 2.5 years of participant observation in 4 different urban neighborhoods in Northern California. This I paired with 60 in-depth interviews with women and men from different racial and socioeconomic groups. The observations provided data about the physical and social dilemmas of old age, something I'm going to talk about shortly, how problems vary between contexts. So how does this manifest in a rich area with a lot of resources or a poor area with cracked sidewalks and a relatively thin social safety net? How do people in both different and similar circumstances respond to the problems and challenges of growing old in a youth-focused society? And the interviews were key as well. So it wasn't simply a participant observation study. They provided me data about people's life histories, past experiences with inequality. So whether or not people grew up in the segregated South and had horrible experiences with doctors had a huge effect on how they responded in the present. And by doing interviews, I was able to, of course I talked to people while I was in the field, but chart this out a little bit more systematically. It also allowed me to understand cultural factors and framings. So people's explanations and justifications of behavior, norms about what somebody should do, and as anybody that's spent time in the field knows, what people say is not necessarily what they do. So actually getting both points was essential for me. And then both provided info about how they make sense of what it means to grow old in the context of American inequality. So I selected 4 neighborhoods in Northern California. I did this by going through census data, selecting a pool of neighborhoods that could possibly fill each of these cells. And the point here wasn't just to select additional neighborhoods for the sake of selecting additional neighborhoods or for demographic variation, which I could have gotten by selecting a neighborhood that has demographic variation, but rather one of the things I was interested in is variation in structural context. There's a huge literature on neighborhood effects. This is not exactly the same as individual resources. So if I'm trying to see whether or not that matters and how it matters, I had to have a comparison. So I could have probably saved time if I wasn't interested in that, but I was. But that being said, I should emphasize this is not the traditional ethnography that aims to provide the social order of the neighborhood. It's not a study of neighborhoods, but rather people that are in neighborhoods. So I selected 4 with socioeconomic and racial variation. 2 were poor, 2 were more middle class, 2 were racially mixed, and here I have the basic breakdown, rank ordered according to populations, and 2 were more racially homogeneous. So the research process, and then I promise this is the last slide on methodology, but this is what I love talking about. So within each neighborhood, I started by spending time in places where seniors congregate. So senior centers, housing facilities, hospitals, but I quickly saw that this was really kind of a naive and not quite exclusive list. So as I spent time with them, I expanded it to include coffee shops, libraries, bars, corner stores, restaurants, etc. Places where people come together, congregate, talk about the challenges of aging, and also negotiate some of the concrete issues. At that point, I developed rapport and spent time with people as they went about their daily lives. Usually, I was the only person under 55 at the setting, so they would naturally ask me, "What are you doing here?" Sometimes I was the only guy if I was at a knitting club, etc. So I just wore my cowl hat, I introduced myself, and I'd say, "I'm doing a project on aging in America," and everybody would say, "Oh, I have a story to tell you." There were a couple places where people were a little concerned with, underground economies and whatnot, but again, spending time in the field allowed me to overcome a lot of that. So as I developed rapport, I went with them to doctor's offices, I went grocery shopping, spent a lot of time, unfortunately, in hospitals. I did chair aerobics, I played bingo, and bingo I find, people find it relaxing. I think it's horribly stressful. It's my sister and my grandma love it. I'm always afraid that I'm going to miss something, which maybe is why I'm an ethnographer. I also spent a lot of time watching daytime TV because there's a lot of downtime when you're in the field. But these are the burdens of spending time with people as they go through their everyday lives. Although the study was primarily prior to institutionalization, I spent a lot of time in nursing homes as people visited friends and relatives. Many were ultimately placed in facilities themselves, and I would continue to visit them. And I also volunteered in one nursing home in Rockport, which was a poor multi-ethnic area, and in Bay Gardens, which was a middle class, primarily white and somewhat Asian area. In the last year, I did my semi-structured in-depth interviews, and at the end of the project, as is typical with this kind of research, I had a ton of observations. I entered them into a CAQDS program, computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software. I realized that after 2 job talks that people didn't know that acronym. So that's what I did. It's not magic, but it helped me look for patterns and see whether or not what I was describing was robust. And then the results that I presented are based on these observable patterns. They're real people and real events. They're not composites in any way, but they are representative of broader patterns. And in accordance with IRB requirements, I use pseudonyms for both the individuals and neighborhoods. But these are real neighborhoods and real people. Okay?
Can I just ask one question on the method?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the places that you observed, and it says public spaces, but since you did start at 60, there may have been a lot of people who are still working.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering whether there's any observation of inequality in the workplace.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And there are a lot of people that are well over 60 that continue to work either in formal or informal economies. And so to the extent that was possible, if that's what they were doing, I try and spend time with them. But, getting access to workplaces, like getting access to schools, could be a little bit trickier than going to a senior center, which, people were quite open to. Okay? So, getting to the overview, the end game, this sort of mirrors my basic structure in the book. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the pieces fit together and then walk through specific mechanisms to the extent that I have time, probably based on past experience, going to get through structure and maybe culture, and then some of you are thinking, well, why would you have a structure-culture dichotomy? That's like 1970s sociology. I'll get to the ontology versus analytical distinction point, hopefully. But here, I'm just providing you a bird's eye view of the larger study. Then I'm going to walk you through some of the specific mechanisms. But I do always get asked, why the game? Why the metaphor of the game? Is it simply because economists talk about game theory? Am I just, bringing Bourdieu in and say, oh, Bourdieu talks about it? I think both of those things are true, But the reason it has a sort of persistent staying power in social science, particularly within the US, is I think it's a useful metaphor and heuristic. And my logic for this goes as follows. Social life, like games, consists of players, their organizing mechanics, shared challenges, dilemmas, etc. that people face. There are temporal phases, that is, in games, innings or quarters or periods, or in the case of our lives, years. There are different styles and strategies. So the Giants might play a different type of baseball than the A's. The 49ers might play a different style of football than the Raiders. It's relational. That is, all this takes place in the context with other actors orienting to one another. I might push it and say there are winners and losers. That is to say, some people reap the rewards of victory, or what constitutes a socially validated understanding of victory. Others do not. And key for me, and this is one of the points, is often games purport to be fair when they're not. And so this is true in social life as well. So, sorry, Patriots fans. When I gave this in London, I realized I didn't understand that, so I did a FIFA thing, and it was right during the FIFA scandal, so that works. Not that this presentation is canned by any means. So the book essentially focuses on 5 different aspects. The first is who gets to play. The second is the organizing mechanics of the game of later life. The third is the uneven playing field on which this takes place. The fourth is the strategies of play that people deploy in addressing shared challenges in unequal contexts. And the fifth is team dynamics, or the role of social networks. So the first point actually takes place, for the most part, before my study. But again, the huge established literature on fundamental causes, mortality differentials, etc., in public health, and the general conclusion being that inequality affects who survives to old age and the number of physical problems they have when there. So one of my favorite quotes, and this is the only quote that I'm going to put up here, is from Fries and Lufty, who really summarize this, I think, in very poignant terms when they note the lower status people are, the sooner they die and the worse health they have while alive. So of course there are exceptions, there are crossover effects, but in general, this is the pattern. Now the point for the end game, and this is why I select the lower threshold of 60, is in understanding inequality in later life, it's important to understand that not everybody survives long enough to get a social security check. And this, in fact, is one of the most fundamental axes of stratification. Who lives and who dies, who gets a chance to grow old and who doesn't. So the most disadvantaged often don't make it to the final inning, and when they do, to extend this sports metaphor, and I'm not a huge sports fan, so I have to learn this, they're sort of beat up. They tend to face the challenges sooner. So the rate at which we age biologically is dependent on our social context. So finally, the literature is catching up to Durkheim. So the shared challenges, well, the onset of old age varies, and what I mean by this is old age as a set of social and biological dilemmas that are intertwined. And so, for instance, a middle-class white woman, on average, might expect to experience a series of health problems or points of stigma later in their life than, say, an African-American man who works in a manual occupation whose body is likely to be worn out before they even enter a study like mine. But among those who survive, there are shared everyday problems, and often they congeal along the bodily aspects of aging. So Tom, so now I end quotes from my respondents, former financier in Bay Gardens, 64-year-old white guy, who, quote, in his term, he was very funny, noted he got to his golden years without enough gold, although he was well off. He had a house, he had a car, he had a pension, but still he broke down the predicaments that he faced in a very systematic fashion. So, according to Tom, so I'm really physically a wreck, and I'm very, very concerned about being able to live by myself because I've lost a lot of flexibility that I used to have. His words, not mine. Seniors are a tough crowd. They're old by definition, and he's smart at that. This is clever. They're cranky. They're often in bad health. They're frequently in mourning for, family or compatriots. And lastly, they're basically sniffing their own mortality, which, as you know, is a tough, tough crowd. So it's telling that when I was doing my interviews, I didn't say I was particularly interested in embodiment or, the physical manifestations of aging, but in all 60 interviews, this came up as central. So this is not my attempt to impose this. When I ask people, what's it like to grow older, they all mention the physical issues. And the general acknowledgement is that circumstances that might be an annoyance in your 20s or might be an annoyance in your 30s, like tripping and falling, something that I've done a few times, becomes a game changer in your 80s or in your 70s once you have osteoarthritis. And the joke that they often bandied around was we're all one fall away from the home. And so for those of you who don't know, the home refers to the nursing home, right? Assisted living is generally seen as quite undesirable. And like all really resonant jokes, it had bite because it sort of referred to something real. That is, this was in fact a somewhat precarious life phase. So the interesting point for me is not just that it gets challenging, but that people from very different walks of life came to describe and understand this in terms that were remarkably convergent across neighborhoods, across demographic groups, in a way that you would not expect to see, or that at least I didn't expect to see. So for instance, James, a 77-year-old African-American man from Rockport who grew up in the segregated South, was describing the experiential shifts of later life in a way that I thought was one of the most articulate and poetic ways, but not atypical in any means. James noted, "No one understands being old but old people. That's just an event that happens, and it's catastrophic. Because you can't sleep the same, you can't eat the same, you can't walk the same, and you don't have the same dreams. Everything changes. Old is a different animal altogether, and the only way you can understand it is you have to get there." And this is a theme that came up again and again. White, African American, Latino. It wasn't particularly confined to a group. Lila, a middle-class white woman in Bay Gardens, said a very similar thing about the experiential shifts when she noted, when you get old, things change how you think and how you feel. And again, this was a major pattern in my data. So although you have two people whose lives were separated not only by space, but the immense chasms of race, class, and gender, in the end, they talked about experiential shifts that were not sui generis, they're not without structural base, but specifically grounded in problems of social action associated with possessing an aging body in a society that valued youth and its sociological significance more broadly. So the issue, if you wanted to put it in terms of capital, was summed up by a retired teacher in Bay Gardens who noted, again quite poignantly, you don't realize how precious the body is until you grow old. And so even if it makes me uncomfortable and I tried to sidestep this, the centrality of the body and what it signifies, what it enables, and what it constrains, that is the body as a resource and a signifier, came up consistently in field work. It was essential to understanding the variation that I saw. That said, the fact that growing older includes aches, pains, health problems, network shrinkage, etc., doesn't mean that people address this on equal footing, right? It actually is quite the opposite. So while the body was a structuring element of everyday life in older age, the capacities for responding to its concrete social predicaments, a fall, a health problem, somebody in the store treating you as though they're seeing only wrinkles, it was not quite carried out on an even playing field. That is to say, there were fundamental differences in resources between people, both on an individual level and a neighborhood level. So that affected how they could respond. So some individuals faced concrete challenges, right? Shared action problems like arthritis, a fall, illness, the death of a friend or loved one, the death of a pet, something that actually came up quite a bit as salient, as a sort of emotional event. Some face these issues with wealth, with pensions, with insurance, with homes that they could take a reverse mortgage on, or they could sublet a room, with robust family that is in the area, with family members that also have resources like money and social ties and education, and others face them relatively alone with few resources. So these are not equally distributed. On the neighborhood level, you see something similar. So even if you are living in a relatively advantaged area, or you're a relatively advantaged person and you happen to age in what might be a more disadvantaged area, there are substantial differences in the services available to you and how you could go about addressing any given issue. So I give the example of Bay Gardens, which was a middle-class area. It had great public transportation, and by great public transportation, I don't just mean they had buses. They had specific senior transportation that was modified, where they'd wait for them. These buses, the free bus as they'd call it, was a point of sociability. It made a huge difference. It took them to the doctor's office, to Trader Joe's, etc. They had good hospitals, and here good, I mean not only by their assessment, but by external assessments. They had all sorts of senior programs. They had food. They had tax help, which was in fact a problem for middle class and upper middle class seniors. The physical environment tended to be well maintained. And so, of course, ethnographers have long cautioned against confusing broken windows with social disorganization. But if there are shards of glass and you have cracks in the pavement, it does affect your ability to navigate as a senior, especially when we're one fall away from the home, as they put it. There was a surplus of volunteers. That is, they had so many volunteers, they didn't know what to do with them. They would just say, okay, we'll go show up and talk to people. They would drive people around. They had subsidized housing that was much nicer than where I was living as a graduate student. They looked like well-maintained condos. And these are all resources that were just not available in Rockport. They just weren't there in the poor area. So Rockport had spotty public transportation. They only had a county program, and the joke was they get you there, but the but being they don't necessarily pick you up. And this is something I actually observed, not only in this project, but in previous projects. It could be pretty spotty. Lower quality hospitals, fewer senior programs that tend to be more dispersed. The public housing did not look like condos. It was not well maintained physically. There's a lot of stuff going on. There wasn't as much volunteerism. The volunteerism tended to be more informal, and a lot of it was focused on youth. And all of this was exacerbated by another structural issue, which was funding inequalities, which is that an entrepreneurial grant process tended to lead to what sociologists might call a compensatory inversion, which is that the neighborhoods with the most formal organizations that had previously won funding were the most likely to win subsequent funding. So it's not that these neighborhoods didn't need money, or that seniors and middle class areas didn't face particular challenges. It's just they tended to get a lot more of the resources. Whereas in areas like Rockport, as one of my respondents put it, the safety net is quite thin. So the behavioral question is, how do these factors shape responses? Right? So I could see, the net effect of neighborhoods in a survey. This is illustrated in a very concrete way. So if this was too abstract, I'm about to get very concrete. When people want the same thing, but inhabit contexts with different resources. So the example I give is running out of Ensure. Do people know what Ensure is? I know, right? It's kind of like a dietary supplement that is commonly used by seniors and cancer patients. Some people say it tastes like tin, others say it tastes like a milkshake. But in this case, I have 3 different people. They all want the same thing. This is not an existential question of values. They've run out of Ensure, they use it as part of their diet, and they want to get some more. But understanding how they respond to that similar dilemma shows a lot about the resources that are available to them. So first, you have Pauline. Pauline was a middle-class African-American woman living in Elm Flats, and when she ran out of Ensure, it was a relatively straightforward process. She could walk to the store, or she would drive and pick it up. So if you're getting a case, you probably want to drive and have them load it. But that was a possibility for her because she had a car, she had money, and she was in relatively good health physically. Then you get to the case of Laura, who is a middle-class white woman, but physically she was in a more precarious position. That is to say, the body structured a lot of the options that were available to her. So she had money, but she couldn't drive. She had an electric wheelchair, but she would be the first to admit she wasn't a great pilot of it, so she didn't feel, super confident taking it out. But she did have a son that visits her, takes care of her. When he would come by, he would bring Insure. He happened to be a computer programmer and had plenty of money to bring a case. It wasn't an imposition to lay down the $50. He saw it as his duty, and even if she didn't have these things, she had money, so she would have been able to hire a helper, right? She had a substantial amount of savings. And then you get to Dave. Now, Dave was a poor white man. He doesn't have a car, or he didn't have a car. He had no close family, so nobody in the area. He would talk to his brother occasionally on the phone, but they weren't living in the same place. It's not that he was living in a food desert. So again, this goes to case selection and Northern California being a conservative case. It's not the south side of Chicago. He was very close to a supermarket. There were farmers markets by him, but 2 blocks was a huge distance. It might as well be walking across town. 2 blocks was just more than he could physically do. He was in an area where there was not a free bus. There was not special coordinated senior transportation. So it was they get you there. And even if he did get there, he didn't have $50 to pay for this Insure. So what does he do? So first, in the case of Dave, he calls a social worker who inevitably insists that he goes to the doctor, right? Whatever it is, you have to go check with the doctor. This requires that he get a ride to the doctor. Again, it wasn't far from his house, but he didn't have a car, he couldn't drive, he didn't want to wait around all day for the transit. So typically, what he would do is he'd bribe the home health aide with extra hours. He said, I'll sign off for 20 hours of work and you only do 10, so you get 10 hours of free work. In this case, we decided, I offered to drive him, and he said, well, I'm helping you with your book, so it's an even exchange. And I said, that's true, actually. You're helping me out more than I'm helping you. So we drove to the free clinic where he did what he calls jumping through hoops. So we waited around for a while. If people aggravate the desk staff, the street-level bureaucrats that allow you access to see somebody quickly or not, you could wait around for hours. In his case, he didn't have a huge amount of energy, so going to the doctor drained what energy he had. And it's not that this is what he wanted to do. He just wanted to get his Insure. But this is something that ended up taking his entire week. So he sees the doctor, lasts about 5 minutes. He got a prescription for the Insure, took a few days to recover. But then he was caught in what might be called a cycle of medical engagement. Or as he put it, they all want to bill you for their 45 minutes. So in this case, this meeting with the doctor begot more meetings with doctors. In this case, 3 appointments, one with a hand surgeon, which medically was a bit ridiculous given his health. There was no chance that they were, in their terms, going to cut on him. A podiatrist, as he had gangrene in his foot, and then a follow-up with the general practitioner. And he used up all his energy to get there. He didn't really want to go to these appointments, especially the one with the surgeon. He too thought it was ridiculous. But as he put it, he didn't want to put up any red flags, to be tagged as somebody engaged in the nebulous term self-neglect and then end up back in a nursing home, which is the place that he had spent time previously. The 2 upshots is he did eventually get his Insure, although it took him a while to recover from this ordeal and get ready for the next one. And he got Vicodin, which he was able to barter for goods and services because it has, quite a bit of value. So in this case, you're looking at different physical capacities. and structural factors that limit what is possible, but it's not the culture, in the sense that sociologists describe it as a sort of symbolic dimensions of social life, meanings, capacities, motivations, etc. It's not that it was irrelevant. So in Dave's case, his skills with navigating bureaucracy, dealing with street-level bureaucrats, his savvy in getting what he wants, something developed from a lifetime on the margins. It's a classical example of a cultural tool. It was instrumental in his ability to get insured and to stay out of a nursing home as long as he did. In the case of Laura, her relationship with her family had normative underpinnings, that is, the expectation of help that made these ties effective. So it's not just that her son had resources, but that he saw it as his obligation. And Paula's value of taking care of things on her own leads to the importance of independence and identity, something Elena has written quite a bit about. So this too is a particular value. But the main story is still one of context and resources. So if you ask me, why did people go about getting insured different ways, this is not about different values or motivations or habitus. They had different resources. But that's not to say culture can have a more direct effect. So what happens when people are equipped for multiple possible lines of action? That is to say, they have resources. They could go to a doctor or a folk healer. Why do some choose the first and others choose the second? And here, culture matters not simply as a resource that facilitates people's responses, but more directly as an input that shapes what's understood as desirable, reasonable, and sensible. That is, what is a good, a moral, a reasonable way to respond to the predicaments of the present, and it's key to charting out a lot of the variation. And for me, this variation is not just a residual to be controlled out, it's a key part of answering why some respond some ways and others respond differently. Which gets to the example of why does Jane skip chemo? So again, this is another sort of very concrete example. So Jane and Lainey were very similar on surveys I've used, like the National Longitudinal Studies on Aging. They would be indiscernible. I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between them. They both had treatable early phase breast cancer. Yet, when presented with this challenge, they responded in very different ways. So Jane was a middle-class white woman. She was college educated, she was smart, she was savvy, she had insurance, she had a car, she had plenty of friends, and she knew that it was a bad move medically and that skipping chemo would likely shorten her life. She could, go through the statistics and explain this. It wasn't that she didn't understand the course of treatment. And she acknowledged this on several occasions, but she typically skipped chemo and she spent her time with her friends. She went to jazz clubs, she went to the bar. She was not, and for her, this was something that was more desirable. And I'm going to get to why that's the case. Lainey looked very similar, yet she got chemo religiously. She went to every scheduled appointment. And so in this case, you have people that are sort of invariant on, the classic variables of information, access, and resources. That is, both of them could have easily attended chemotherapy. They're in the same context. They're facing the same problem. They look the same on surveys. Jane did not lack cognitive flexibility. It wasn't that she couldn't put things together. But it's something more basic, and for a lot of social scientists, more troubling, because it had to do with differences in what people want. So in the insurer example, people want the same thing, but they had different resources. But in the chemo example, they had similar resources, to put it crudely, but they wanted different things. So this points to the importance of motivations and orientations, which again have to do with their experience with the social world. They're not reducible to pure psychology or chance. So Jane simply did not like feeling bad. She wanted to enjoy her life while she could. She saw anything else as unreasonable, and so she attempted to maximize excitement, as she had done earlier in her life. For Lainey, she wanted to preserve her body. She wanted to stay healthy and independent, not only for herself, but her family. And the idea that Jane, who became a vignette in my interview schedule, would do something else seemed not only strange, but immoral, irresponsible. It wasn't just a way of acting, it was a wrong way to act. People would say, why are you doing that sort of asinine thing? And the reason I present this example is not because it's an isolated story or Jane was a particular outlier, but it was part of a broader pattern of divergent behaviors, or as I call it, preserving the body versus maximizing enjoyment. So the question that often comes up, and I have, about 10 more minutes? 10 more minutes? Okay. So I'll at least get through some of the culture stuff. Is how is this culture? I guess at the crudest point, somebody might say, this is immoral. Jane makes bad decisions. That's not my job as a social scientist. I wouldn't say that. But, somebody might say, quite reasonably, this is just individual psychology. But it's not. So on the first point, it has a strong moral component. So each saw the other not only as responding to a predicament in an equally reasonable way, but they saw the other as immoral. And they would say, I don't want to be with people like that. They don't have their priorities straight. That is, it always takes on a moral valence. The second point is this is not sui generis, but rooted in prior social experiences. So these motivations, these differences in what people saw as desirable, were related to how they had experienced life earlier. So in the case of Jane, she had rheumatoid arthritis when she was young. She had trouble working. She had to depend on people. She learned, as she put it, that nothing lasts forever. So her response, and it's a reasonable response if you take it on the point of coherence, was to try and enjoy life while she could. So this involved bars, dancing, jazz, etc. So it wasn't just a point of individual preferences. It was something that had a deep moral connotation that affected how people responded to one another, and that was forged as a set of cognitive inputs over the life course. It didn't suddenly emerge in old age. There was quite a bit of continuity. So one more example, and then I'll sum up. So motivations here shape desirable ends, but that's not to say that culture is reducible to motivations or that we should simply go back to Weber's switchman. There's a second level of inputs that shapes what's seen as a reasonable response. So if maintaining the body as long as you can is what's desirable, there are different ways to go about that, right? Some of this is structurally determined, but some of it is not. So in the case of Ray versus Bill, the question here is, why does Ray avoid the doctor like the plague while Bill goes all the time, or at least goes regularly? Now in this case, they have essentially invariant, they're at least in the same camp in terms of both attempting to maximize preservation, to extend the body and independence as long as it can, yet they do it in very different ways. And this again comes back to cultural orientations that have to deal with prior experiences with inequality, and in fact, whether they saw the body as a medical object, one to be maintained and taken care of by experts, or if it were a natural organic product that took care of itself. So Bill, who fell into the medical category, explained, I have my doctor and we have a regular schedule. They draw my blood and I come home and have a meeting the following week, and he and I check on everything. And on the other hand, Ray explained, again, he had access to a hospital. He was able to go. He could have seen the doctor regularly. Quote, the whole system is about money-making schemes or, quote, bullshit systems and programs. And this, in fact, was something that came up quite a bit. Another senior voiced a similar concern when he told me, doctors bug me because I know they're just juicing it for the money. So how does Ray preserve the body, given his distrust, his unwillingness to acknowledge that particular form of authority? Well, he put it, I rest, I see what sort of herbal concoctions sound best, but mostly just rest. The body heals itself, so again, this is a sort of natural body orientation. The body has all types of natural healings inside of it. You leave it alone instead of loading it up with chemicals. When you get a cut, I don't care how deep it is, all you have to do is stop the bleeding and it patches itself up. So again, how they could respond is based on the physical challenges they were facing, the structural environment that they were in, what they were motivated towards doing, that is a desirable end of maintaining the body as long as possible, but also you have to look at orientations and what they saw as a reasonable way to pursue those goals. And so in this case, Ray explained to me why he had these feelings, which were common among other natural body seniors. Not only were they skeptical of medical expertise and this idea that it was operating as a for-profit system, they talked about medical errors in the past of friends and family. So seniors that were subject to botched surgeries and whatnot, even if they were from the middle class, tended to fall into this orientation. And in the case of people like Ray, who grew up during segregation and remember the Tuskegee experiments, there was a decidedly racial dimension. So for them, the idea that you simply trust doctors, that they're operating on you like a mechanic fixing a car, was not something that jived with their sensibilities. Again, not simply psychology. It was shaped by prior experiences, institutionalized racism, insensitivity, etc., and it had a major effect. Okay. So now, if I have to sum up, and I'm only running a little bit over time. So here is where I attempt to reduce my years of field observation to 5 bullet points. And we'll see how effectively I do that. But if I were to do that, which I'm doing, it would essentially look like this. The first phase in understanding the end game is looking at what demographers euphemistically call selective mortality, right? So essentially, this is the inequality that plays out prior to old age, who lives to grow old and who dies before ever getting the chance, right? So this is a key part of the story, even though it's not the focus of my ethnographic research. However, there are shared action problems, organizing mechanics in the parlance of the game for those that survive. These focus on the issues of physical change and what that signifies in real-world settings. And this is something that is faced across communities, across demographic groups, and in fact, every time I've tried to sidestep it, a senior comes and corrects me and says, if anything, you're understating the effect of this. In the present, it's not to say that people face this on an even playing field. They face structural inequalities that continue to shape which responses are plausible. So it's hard to go to a good doctor if there are none around. It's hard to buy insurance simply if you don't have the money. And this is a key part of the story. But it's not reducible to this, even if that's where I would suggest that we make our policy interventions. Understanding the complex variation requires looking at what we have historically called culture as a resource, but also as a set of motivations, orientations, socially shaped experiences that affect what people see as desirable, reasonable, and sensible given the realm of possibilities available to them. And here, again, I want to emphasize that this is not sui generis, but it's based on prior experiences with an unequal social world. So inequality doesn't simply emerge at age 60, and it doesn't go away at age 60 either. Finally, networks, which I haven't talked about much or at all, connect these factors by shaping both who you know, that is a structure of social relations, but also, as I alluded to, the normative underpinnings, that is to say the cultural constituency of networks that affect what who you know means, as well as the network inequalities that affect the resources they bring to bear in helping you. So, implications, do this briefly. I think there are a lot with policy issues and whatnot, but I'm not going to focus on this. You can look at the New York Times thing on that or my Atlantic piece. But sociologically, it's important for understanding the relationship between inequality and the life course, not only in the sense that there's sometimes a flawed model that inequality doesn't continue into old age, but analytically, that examining the inequalities in old age and how that shapes people's possibilities tells us a lot about the mechanisms of stratification more generally. The second point has to deal with the relationship between inequality and the body. And in this case, it often makes some people uneasy. They want to have a disembodied model of human actors where, there's simply choices and social beings outside of biology. But in the case of aging, it underscores the importance of looking at how the body is not simply, a neutral construct, but it becomes a social structure that shapes the actions and the possibilities that are available to people. And I fall into the camp that attempted to discount this embodiment, and it just did not work with my data. And the seniors constantly pointed out that it didn't work. They said I was being too optimistic. And then finally, in the point of inequality in culture, this could be phrased in a simple manner and has been phrased like this for me before. Does culture matter for inequality? And for me, that's a simple answer. It's yes. But the data that I present speaks to a trend that one sees in modern social science, which is to say that this, in fact, just is not a good question to ask. The better question when we're talking about stratification in inequality is when and how do the material and symbolic aspects of social life stratify in structure, and how are they connected? And here is where my answer is multifaceted. The meanings, motivations, and resources that people have provide a temporal link between prior experiences and present lines of action by shaping what's desirable, reasonable, and possible in the present. So the answer here is a bit inconvenient. It doesn't translate as well to parsimonious models of social action, even if we compress these as cultural capital and habitus. And it might be easier to have practical interventions if Jane and Lainey actually wanted the same thing, but they don't. And to pretend that they don't is simply ignoring their experience and the reality of how they approach the world. So the point here is that it's not that structure doesn't matter, it's not that embodiment doesn't matter, but culture continues to matter, and it matters because it shapes the responses to the inequalities that people experience, it shapes their experiences with inequality, and it shapes how they act in later life. So understanding the end game is really an exercise in understanding not reduction to a single factor, but how various mechanisms are connected and intertwined to shape people's lives in various ways. So that's... No.
Go ahead, John, and then Elena. Right? Can I write this down?
Should we just fire away?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks, I think this is great. I think you did a really nice job of richly describing inequality in outcomes in the Asian. But I'm a little confused. I think I heard shape is a causal word, and so I think you're using inequality as a cause, as an explanatory variable. But I didn't hear you disentangle that from levels of income.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I heard is that poor people don't do very well in the end game. And it's the level of their resources coming into it that matters. But the counterfactual thought is that you have the same position in your income distribution, but the income distribution looks different. The Gini coefficient is different, net of your level of income. And I don't know how you're separating that. So you did a very good job explaining to me how the levels of capital that you come into old age with dictate the distribution of the outcomes. But I didn't hear how inequality net of your level of income is a cause here.
Great. So that's a great question, and Christine is telling me I should stand up.
Yes.
When I asked this, so I came from Arizona, and it's actually hotter here, which is go figure. So that's a really good question, and I talk about it a lot in the book, and it comes back to a simple point that Bourdieu made quite well, which is that capital has multiple forms. So, for me, it's not saying that it's fundamental, it's only about socioeconomic inequality. The fundamental cause but it has to deal with people's social capital. So one might be in a poor neighborhood, could have robust social networks, friends and family that help them, a particular way of approaching diet and experience that might in fact improve their outcomes relative to somebody else that had a higher level of income. Right. Likewise.
But those are just levels of whatever you want to think is the cause. So my question is, how does the distribution of those things, net of your levels of them, cause it? Right? When we want to say inequality causes something, we don't mean that it's not just your level of having it, it's how it's distributed around you that we think matters, net of the level. So call it income, call it social capital, call it whatever you want. How are you disentangling the level from the distribution?
Well, so for me, I mean, part of this comes back to the fact that as an ethnographer, I'm not answering a distributional question. That my methods, in fact, are ill-suited to speaking to the relative predictive validity of income versus social networks in later life. In fact, there are other ways to do this, and I'm not, against those other ways. My job, as I see it, and I can't, the reason it seems like I'm punting is I can't answer this question with my data. What I do is I show how these mechanisms operate. So when you say, whether or not somebody gets insured, how they get insured, that's what I'm describing. So the link, right, between different levels of, say, material, financial capital, physical capital, social capital, link to different actions, understandings, as well as outcomes. The distributional question is something I can't answer with ethnographic data.
So let me just clarify. I think what Sean is saying is inequality as a thing. So for poor people, does the fact of there being rich people, or
Yes.
do they talk about, is that that I think is what
Right,
Sean
like how does
said.
the Gini of your neighborhood, net of your position in the income distribution, actually affect it? So and I don't know that you can't do that. I think that's really interesting, but just that's when I hear you call inequality a cause, what Deborah said is exactly what I'm thinking. It's not your
When
level.
poor kids go to play a sports game at a rich school and they're like,
That's
how come my school doesn't look like
right,
this?
right.
That kind of
Right. So, I guess I might parse that out into, how does class matter and what's the role of neighborhood effects? So in terms of the role of neighborhood effects, even if somebody had a similar level of income, they had a pension, they had an education, the fact that they are operating in a social context with high levels of crime, with relatively sparse social services, et cetera, is going to shape the available paths of action available to them. There's also a sort of cultural dimension in terms of how people experience the world, and they do absolutely talk about inequalities, although some of them are more hesitant about talking about the racial dimensions. So a lot say, I remember giving the survey and saying, well, how would you identify, in terms of race and ethnicity? And they say, that's a ridiculous question, sociologist, I'm an American. And these were people from different groups. So I always found that sort of pushback quite interesting. But I'd say that people that had a lot of experiences with inequality, with navigating bureaucracy, as in the case of Dave, with being slighted and dealing with status losses and interactions, had a certain degree of aptitude as they faced those in later life. So here, inequality as a sort of temporal component, that is inequality at time prior, leads to a set of resources for adapting in the present. So, breaking it down, you have, neighborhood effects, which shape the options available to people. You have individual resources that shape the options that are available to people. You have how they understand the world, which shapes what they see as desirable and reasonable. You have their levels of social capital or social connectedness that, cannot just be simply operationalized, and I kind of skip this slide because I always do, I ran out of time, to whether or not somebody's tied or how many ties that they have, but in fact what those ties mean, what are the norms around reciprocity, is it expected to help, and even if we control that, right, and we say everybody, these people want to help, I provide more resources in helping as a PhD in sociology that is very good at talking to doctors than my mother, who's a waitress, does when we go and we try and advocate for our grandmother. So my answer is deliberately, if it seems convoluted, anti-reductionist, because for me, it's not about charting a distribution, but showing how the mechanisms within that distribution play out.
Okay, let's move on. Elena?
So related to the mechanisms of the inequality, something that for me, one of the most interesting parts of the book and the presentation is when you compare two different neighborhoods. One is the neighborhood without, one is the one, plenty of volunteer, transportation, you can go anywhere, and good hospitals, plenty of resources, versus the other neighborhood, no volunteerism, geared towards youth, and terrible transportation system, etc. So something that I would like to better understand is how come there are these two big differences in neighborhoods that maybe I'm wrong, but I assume they are not that far from one another.
Right. And I think some of this has to do with differences. We like to say the state, but the state is actually multi-level. There are a number of different cogs in the machine.
Yeah.
And so whether or not something is provided as a federal level, a county level, or a city level is going to matter. Likewise, if you have a middle class organization with, sort of mobilized, senior groups that are advocating for and applying for these block grants, it brings additional money in. So part of it has to do with, inclusion and exclusion, who do we value and who do we not. But in a more sort of impersonal, almost Weimarian sense, there are a lot of different levels that you have to look at. And those lead to what we might call the compensatory inversions, where some neighborhoods tend to accumulate resources, just like we accumulate resources over the life course, and others tend to accumulate disadvantages. Right? So it's, some of it has to do, you might say, oh, well, we don't want to put resources there. But I think some of it is actually more insidious. It's like an entrepreneurial, well, everybody gets a shot at the grants, just like we all get a shot at the American dream, except some of us have a better shot than others. And the same is true with neighborhoods.
Okay, Frank is next, then Jaren, then Stacy.
So there was something in your book that, and by the way, buy it on Amazon, like it on Facebook.
No, we've
It's
got
really
it in the
good.
back.
Oh,
After the
it's
talk.
really good.
Now you're making me uncomfortable.
It's really good.
But there was
Only mean things, only mean things.
in the book that really struck me, and then you mentioned it in your talk, and that was the use of drugs as a transactional mechanism. And I mean, is there a whole story there? I assume that people learn or become informed by other folks about drug-seeking behavior that they can then turn into, to trade, and they don't seem to trade it for cash as much as they trade it for services. Something interesting going on there that seems fascinating.
Right, and I think that if my next project were to be on seniors, it might be on the sort of informal economy, because it's not just about drugs, it's about who gives rides, who allows, a sort of, semi-unhoused person to come in their room, and then how do they, Elena has a project on this, deal with the consequences of that. The drugs, for me, were particularly interesting because, again, for seniors, it had such a strong moral component. So they divided, even people that were in their 90s, so I describe someone like this in their book, would say, well, I don't want to be hooked. And their kids would say, well, you're 90, you have osteoarthritis, you're in constant pain, you're not sleeping well, why don't you just take the Vicodin? And for them, it was this process of boundary work. I don't want to be that sort of person. I don't want to be a dope fiend. And a lot of those people also tended to be the more straight arrow ones that would not exchange this on the market. But if you're living in a context of scarcity and you have Vicodin, which is selling for $4 or $5 a pill, it may have gone up or may have gone down, that becomes a different decision. So people used it in different ways when they had that resource, depending on what they valued and what they saw as reasonable. But there was a lot of boundary work between those who saw getting hooked as the worst possible thing, and those who saw people like this 90-year-old senior as somebody that's totally ridiculous. And they'd say, why would you want to be old and in pain so you could continue drawing this distinction that's irrelevant? They probably wouldn't say this distinction that's irrelevant or epiphenomenal, but they would say it much more clearly and in an articulate way that people would understand. So a lot of it had to do with this sort of boundary work. And so how they engaged with informal economies that people saw in both poor neighborhoods and less poor neighborhoods was in fact shaped by a lot of these factors. But again, those operating in the poor neighborhoods, which count on informal economies for a number of different things, tended to be both more adept and more comfortable with this sort of behavior. It was simply an economic resource that one might exchange.
Jaron, you're next.
Thanks for the great talk. I actually find you pretty charismatic, and I hope that comes across in the best way. What lights me up is this structure culture thing, and I'm not convinced that's old sociology. I mean, that's a really lively topic of debate in terms of explaining urban violence and organizational analysis, and that's just good stuff. So I'm wondering about if you can say more about cultural mechanisms, and in particular, like what kinds of prior experiences shape people's perceptions of ways of responding to physical ailments and so on, and are those preferences themselves shaped by objective considerations in the past, like other class-based experiences, or what kinds of schema or frames come in and where they come from?
Great, that's a great question, because it allows me to hit on a couple of points that I probably meandered over in the talk. So the first is the utility of the structure-culture distinction. And I remember presenting this the first time and someone saying, oh, well, post-Sewell, structure and culture are mutually constitutive, and, we'll just, use some other term. And ontologically, I think there's some value in that. So I provide what, I hope is a relatively anti-reductionist framework that shows when and how different facets of inequality shape life. But if you were to say the world is messy and these things are all tied up together, I would absolutely agree with that. But in terms of explaining action and outcomes, and particularly when we start talking about where we might intervene in policy or the human dimensions, which is something that I take very seriously, there is an analytical distinction between whether or not somebody goes to the doctor because they don't trust doctors and they don't like doctors, they don't want to go to the doctor, versus whether or not they have access to a doctor. And so for me, analytically, that's a key distinction, but both, in fact, are shaped by inequality. Mm-hmm. So, whether or not we have access to a doctor is going to be affected by the neighborhood we're in, the resources available to us, not just whether or not we have a doctor, whether or not we have access to, a good doctor or top quality medical resources. Whether or not we trust a doctor, whether or not we see doctors as, sort of experts that help us in maintaining our health, is going to be affected by other things. So, for instance, if we remember the Tuskegee experiments, I think we're going to be a little bit more skeptical of medical researchers, or at least my respondents were. People that had had botched surgeries, had had negative interactions, everything from dentists to bureaucrats, to clinicians, tended to be more skeptical of those organizations. They tended to be more skeptical of the surveillance involved. And this, when you say, how is it shaped by inequality? A lot of this is unobserved in my study because I start in old age. I mean, somebody said, well, why don't you observe that? And I'm like, well, I'd have to follow them from birth to death, and if I could do that, that would be excellent. But it's hard to do that. So a lot of this is based on proxies, reports, based on life history. But what people described, in a very typically coherent way, was the way their prior experiences with the world, being treated badly by a doctor, having a cousin or a sister or a spouse die because of what they perceive to be medical malpractice. Not something that I could adjudicate. I mean, it could be, it could not be. It's unobserved. But the point here is that those understandings are not evenly distributed. Health resources are not evenly distributed. Spatial resources are not evenly distributed. And hence, our experience, what I might call culture as this temporal link, is shaped in concrete material circumstances. So it's not to say culture as like an ethnic culture, or culture simply as values, but as motivations, orientations, strategies, and resources shaped in experiences past and present, affected how people responded, and experiences past and present are never equal. Or I'd say in practice they aren't equal. So there was a guy at Harvard, psychologist named Valiant, and he was saying he does this sort of, Harvard longitudinal study where they take a bunch of, white male Harvard grads and then they track them. And his conclusion, is, well, the decisions we make, really matter and our preferences matter, all else being equal. And the point that I made when I was taking my cheap shot at him in the Atlantic was, that may be true, but the simple sociological reality is all else is never equal.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I've got Stacy and you and Marion in the queue. So maybe you can each ask your question, and then Corey can kind of offer a quick answer to all three. So let's start with Stacy.
Okay. Thanks so much for a really interesting presentation. So certainly a lifetime of accumulated disadvantage is going to make something very, very difficult for poor and working class older people, as you discussed. But there's some research that suggests that people who are formerly privileged, when they experience a status loss and these new hurdles, experiences perhaps even more keenly. So I was wondering if you saw a little bit of this. And then I guess related, I wonder how people's prior health problems or experiences shaped or influenced their experience of the body breaking down. So for example, if you have somebody that's had, chronic illness prior to the age of 60 and disability, did they experience these things a little bit differently? Although you did mention that a common theme was that aging and the body breaking down was a catastrophe.
Right, so that's...
Okay, wait. Okay, let's get your question, and then Marion, and then Corey Lance.
Okay. I first off want to thank you for the talk as well. I really like the idea of thinking about the symbolic and the materiality of aging and inequality. And I understand that life course theory is actually more ingrained about the individual perspective because you're tracing that person's genealogy from childhood all the way into adulthood. And so when thinking about structure and culture, I was wondering what attention you pay to history and the history of actual racial and ethnic groups and their experiences of aging, because I think that there's a literature that kind of suggests that looking at life course theory can be limited in understanding cultural and cultural and structural implications when we don't take history into account. So I was wondering kind of what perspective you offer about the history that maybe the African American and Latinos of your group and even the poor whites, sort of how those experiences might also inform them structurally. And then in cultural aspect, I was wondering what kind of attention you pay to religiosity and how faith actually sort of emphasizes the centrality of the physical body in a way, and how that can either be a way for them to practice agency or strategy, or also hamper their own misgivings about their body and their experiences.
That's a big question. Marion?
There's like 3 questions. I have them. I'll do my best to answer all of these.
Okay, last one.
Okay, so I was just wondering if you could bring up a little bit more the interactional depth of your fieldwork. One of the things when you presented your data is mostly, people make these choices and they have these resources and so on, but we never get a sense of what you observed when you saw these people interact with nursing home staff, with doctors, social services, and so on and so forth. So, and how did the forms of capital affect the interaction? And here I'm not talking about your answer before, which was about, what people reported about past interactions, but what you, as an ethnographer, could observe.
Okay, so
You have 3
three.
minutes.
And these are all great questions. So I'll go to the first one, and then the second and third for me are somewhat related because they have to do with data presentation, reduction, style, and book versus 50-minute talk. So on the point of status losses, absolutely. I think that's the case. That I gave this example of the financier. He was comparatively well off. I mean, I know a lot of seniors that would love to own a house and have a car, but for him, he was used to being sort of the big shot around the office. So that fall to just being, a set of wrinkles was in fact substantial. You might see the same thing in a more physically oriented group. So if you value, what's considered beauty, and you were, a lot of seniors talk about this. You were always considered beautiful, and now you're just an old person. That's a very sharp point. Or talking about masculinity and identity. One of the seniors who had made a living through manual labor his entire life said a man's got a certain image to project, and that don't include doctors. And so here, absolutely there are sort of identity processes, and I talked about that, in the body chapter, but I kind of glossed over it because I wanted to get to what I thought was a more contentious, if you will, structure, culture, dichotomy, and sort of analytical point. So the question about, does that answer your question? So yes, I think you're absolutely right. I agree. Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think that was absolutely something that I observed. And, likewise, people that had been in really difficult circumstances would say, well, I'm blessed. I'm here today. There was a woman.
Now you addressed it.
Yeah, right. So, I had two people, this gets to my analytical pairings, in a nursing home. Both were essentially bedbound. The one, said, I'm just here all day dying and waiting to die with other people that are around me dying. They control my body. They control my biology. And the other person who had faced a lot of hardships in her life said, well, I'm blessed to be here. I have my friends. I have food. And I think that actually matters quite a bit. But the outcome, they are both bedbound. So the point about history, I think, is really important. So it has to deal with the way that part of it is how I deal with it, as somebody on a more behavioral, analytical inclination versus a different type of ethnographer. So for me, the historical depth is always important, but I can't focus on everything in every project. And part of it is I'm so long-winded as it is, getting it into like a manageable bit presupposes cutting some of this out. So what I look at, is the variance and invariance of experience. History matters in the extent that it affects not only the material and spatial distribution of resources, which areas are poor, which areas are not, who has a beat up body by the time they get to old age, who doesn't, but also people's experiences and the fact that people, did talk about things like, religion and, belief in, a higher power, or they talk about, persistent discrimination, or they talk about overcoming. So there's personal history and there's social history, and these affect both material resources and individual experiences. And so on the point about interactional depth, I think that's well taken. And again, this sort of goes to the difference in the way that I approach ethnography. And I don't say difference in like a normative sense. I'm very much a pluralist. I never say you have to do what I do. But for me, even though I try to be anti-reductionist, it's about tracing out pathways, tracing out mechanisms. And, given a talk, I could go through and I could say, okay, so I was at the senior center. I'm not saying this to be dismissive of the people that do this in any way. So I was at the senior center, and Joe fell. I knew Joe from this. His friend said, get up, take a licking, and keep on ticking. So this is an example I give in the book. I try to articulate how these things play out. But for me, when you say, what am I ultimately trying to get out? Am I trying to get at history, stories, giving voice? It's not what I see myself as doing. What I see myself as doing is charting out analytical pathways. So it's a different approach. So I think some of that is a result of the format, and what I want to include. I think I include a lot more of it in the book. But some of it does, point to a different epistemic orientation as, sort of an analytical realist ethnographer.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Great